But one thing that the Army and the Navy were concerned about was, of course, it was well known that if you declared yourself to be homosexual, you would be given this blue discharge, and the armed forces had the idea that heterosexual people who wanted to avoid military service would claim to be gays or lesbians in order to avoid having to join the services. This practically never happened in real life, although towards the end of the war there were some black people who were being so discriminated against and being treated in racist ways that they actually claimed to be homosexual because it was much easier for them to identify as homosexual and get a blue discharge that way than for them to have to prove that they had been treated in racist ways. Um, on the other hand, the psychiatrists who had actually originally kind of spearheaded the move to make homosexuality a mental illness rather than a crime found themselves in the peculiar situation where if a gay man or lesbian came to an army psychologist or an army chaplain for help, the psychologist or the chaplain the job of that man was or woman was to get that person kicked out of the army. Ordinarily, when you go to a doctor or a psychiatrist or a clergyman, there's confidentiality. The things that you're telling the people are not supposed to be reported to anybody else. But if you went and told a doctor you were gay, then the doctor was supposed to inform the authorities, and there would be the process started of giving you a blue discharge. So a lot of the psychiatrists who were sympathetic to the gay people, and also a lot of people who just felt that we needed every man and woman we could get for service in the army, would fudge the situation. They would either, if they were supposed to be giving this person a discharge, they would do it on the basis of some other medical illness that the person would receive an honorable discharge, which didn't give you the same kind of trouble in civilian life that a blue discharge would. But that wasn't always possible, and also the process that a person went through in receiving a blue discharge was very public. You met in front of an intelligence officer who might hound you and try to get you to name other gay people that you had sex with or that you knew. You didn't have any right to call a lawyer. You didn't even have to be the right to be present at a meeting of the people who were deciding your future fate. And because the discharge was based not on any particular thing you'd done, but just on the fact that you were a homosexual, they could kick you out of the army just for saying you had feelings about it. You didn't actually even have to have done anything for them to give you a blue discharge. This actually also made it interesting situation for the women who were brought into the service after the beginning of the war under there were various organizations started, such as the Women Air Corps, the WACs, the Women's Auxiliary to the Navy, the WAVES. There was also one for the Marines and one for the Coast Guards. I forget the acronyms for those. The armed services had been open to women, had been made open to women in World War II because we really needed everybody, every able-bodied person, male or female, that we could get. And for that reason, fewer women were convicted of, or not even convicted. You were not being convicted of a crime. You were just being told that you were getting thrown out of the army for being gay or a lesbian. Fewer women were thrown out of the army because they'd been admitted into the army for the first place on the basis of there being a severe shortage of people. The women were not fighting in combat. The women were doing the kinds of things that women were often traditionally doing in civilian life. They were typists working in offices. So one of the things that was really popular for women to volunteer to do was to train to become mechanics specialists, fixing up automobiles and tanks and things like that, which was, of course, not a traditional job associated with women. But it was with great reluctance that the armed forces accused women of lesbianism or kicked them out because of lesbianism. But it did happen. You don't have as many good statistics for the women as you do for the men, but between 1941 and 1945, grouping the men and women together, more than 4,000 sailors, male and female, in the Navy, about 5,000 soldiers in the Army were discharged from the Army with a notation on their discharge papers saying that they had been discharged for being homosexuals. And there was really very little they could do about that. Actually, one of the interesting things that happens is that as the war progresses, we begin to need manpower more and more desperately. Some men who had received blue discharges were reinducted into the Army. Of course, it was known, it was in their record that they had been thrown out of the Army for being gay. So when they came back into the Army, everybody knew that that's why they had been thrown out. So you can imagine how difficult that situation was. And also one of the things that happens, especially in far off places, like soldiers who were stationed in the Aleutians, the islands off the coast of Alaska, for instance, if it was such a difficult situation there, just physically, terrible weather, incredible isolation, and if a man was sent home for being gay, from a situation like that, the other men resented it very severely because they all wanted to go home too. The fact that the guy had been sent home for being gay didn't really matter to them. The idea is, why does he get to go home and not me? So the situation, I mean, the idea of sending these gay men and lesbians home, the idea of getting them out of the Army, was that having them in the Army would upset everybody. I mean, that was actually the argument that was being used in the 1990s when Bill Clinton was trying to overturn the ban on gays in the military. The idea was, you can't have these people in the Army or Navy because there's so much discrimination against them that the soldiers wouldn't put up with it. Well, of course, you're making the discrimination continue by taking that attitude. But, of course, they weren't really interested in looking at it that carefully. However, I would make the point, in terms of the World War II situation, that in the long term, in some ways, World War II was beneficial to gays and lesbians in the United States, notwithstanding the terrible things that many thousands of them had to undergo, because it was a situation where you were identifying with what you were. I mean, I mentioned before that in the 1930s, lesbians were reading novels about lesbians and thinking, okay, I'm a lesbian. And very often it was the case, actually, that one of these men who was charges were being brought against him for homosexuality, that was the first time it had ever occurred to me. He's like, oh, okay, yeah, they're right about that. I am a homosexual. And furthermore, the people who were being pulled from the countryside, people who were being drafted from places like Iowa, were being brought together with lots more men or lots more women than they had ever been in social contact with before. Gay people found each other. Gay people who were sent to the port cities where there were lots of sailors and lots of soldiers would find the bars in town that specialized in welcoming gay men or lesbians or both. So by the end of the war, you really had a gay and lesbian community that you hadn't had before. And furthermore, and this is almost as important, you had a gay and lesbian community that had a reason to be angry at the way they had been treated by the government. In the 1920s, gays and lesbians were sort of accepted in a kind of halfway sense. They weren't stigmatized. It was considered that if you were a gay man or a lesbian, there was something kind of wrong with you. But nobody said that you didn't have a right to be to serve your country, for instance. And the people who had served their country and been successful were saying, I'm a as good a veteran as anybody else. Why don't I get the same kind of peacetime recognition and the same kind of civil rights that some heterosexual person does who has served his country or her country? And as I'll point out in what I hope will be the next lecture, I want to do a few more before the semester ends. They come back to a country which in the 1950s is very anti-homosexual. And a lot of these people who had been treated badly in the army because of their homosexuality, and then they come back to the United States where it's the stigma against homosexuality is in some ways even worse. This is one of the things that leads eventually to the start of the gay and lesbian liberation movement, which started, by the way, long before 1969. There's a particular event in June of 69 called the Stonewall Riots, which you have probably all heard of. We just recently celebrated the 50th anniversary. But before 1969, in the 50s and 60s, there were gay liberation and lesbian liberation organizations. They were not well, they didn't have large memberships and they were not well known, but they did exist. And lots of the people who were working in these organizations were people who had met each other in the war, and people who were looking at the way gay veterans and lesbian veterans were treated and saying, we've got to somehow get together and form groups to try and change this situation. One of the first membership groups for gays and lesbians that was established in the United States after the war was a group of gay and lesbian veterans. So I think it would be fair to say that in the long run, the World War II was a good thing for gays and lesbians, because actually, among other things, the World War II was what enabled a lot of people to think of themselves as gays and lesbians, enabled them to establish in their head the concept that I'm not, it's not just that I'm a guy who happens to have an interest in going to bed with other guys. I am a member of an oppressed minority. And I can identify with that minority and be proud of being a member of that minority in a way that the United States doesn't seem to be interested in letting me be proud of being a citizen of the United States. So hopefully I'll get at least one more lecture in here before the end of the semester. And until then, see you soon.